Vocal mixing is no easy feat, and that's probably why you're here watching this video. You want to find ways to get better with your vocal mixing and maybe even vocal recording. Well, I've done a lot of videos all about stuff that you should be mindful of, whether it's vocal editing or how to create your own vocal chains. And if you haven't seen any of these videos, I'll leave some links to them in the description below. But they're very helpful videos, and I wanted to take it a step further and continue helping you, especially if you're an artist that's recording and mixing themselves. What I want to talk about today is the vocal bus. You might be wondering to yourself, how is that any different from the vocal chain and other things that you've talked about? It is actually very different, and it's more of an extension of these processes. The vocal bus really is where all the vocals, the leads, the backgrounds, the ad-libs, they all come together and merge at this one point. And the way that you process your vocal bus can really make or break how your song sounds and how your vocal sounds, whether or not it's going to be very upfront and in your face and have a certain texture, or maybe be more lackluster and in the background. I'm going to break down how I approach processing my vocal bus and hopefully leave you with a bunch of gems that you can take and incorporate into your own mixes. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy, 5-Piece producer and engineer extraordinaire. Thank you for checking out today's video, and we're just going to get right to it. So let's get on to Pro Tools and first discuss how a vocal bus is different from an actual vocal chain. So I've got a session that I mixed here. It's Everything Ocean's latest song, Thessaloniki. Great track. A lot of people are really liking it. And if you like what you're hearing as I work through this, check out the description below. I'll leave a link to it down there. But as you can tell, these are all my individual vocal tracks, the verse, the hook, the outro, the ad-libs, all kinds of stuff, right? You can see it's the individual tracks, the audio that corresponds to them. And these ultimately feed up to other tracks, other masters or groups. When we're talking about vocal chains in some of my past videos, we would really be focusing on this. Let's just look at the verse, for example. We'd be looking at all of the plugins that I have on the chain, and this would be the vocal chain, but that would only pertain to this single piece of audio or this single performance, right? The hook and the ad-lib and the outro, these other parts are going to be processed a little bit differently and have their own unique vocal chains, as you can tell. It might consist of similar plugins, but I'm not necessarily approaching each the same. Well, this is important because these are great for individual tracks and how we're approaching the processing of these individual tracks, but eventually all of these tracks combine, right? The verse and the hook, or maybe the verse and the ad-libs underneath it, maybe the moments that transition between. There's going to be overlap between these individual vocals, and that could be good, it could be bad, it's really going to depend, but we're going to be able to allow ourselves to process this a little bit more if we're using a vocal bus, and that's where all of these vocals ultimately go to. As you can see, I have my a cappella master, and that's what this vocal bus would be called. And I'm doing some additional processing, once again, to make sure that everything within the track itself, within these individual elements and how they combine, just to make sure that they are balanced and they sound good, because without this processing, as you're going to see in a moment, may not necessarily have as much impact or depth or just hit the same way as when I'm processing them in the way that I'm about to show you. So with that in mind, let me actually play this one time and just bypass every single plugin, and I'll put it in and we'll actually listen and pay attention to what this sounds like with and without my vocal bus processing. So let's check this out and let's focus specifically on the hook.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time.
Just for good measure, I'm going to play it one more time without the instrumental, just the a cappella solo, because I do know that some people will get really fussy if I don't play it like this. So check this out one more time. Same exact thing with and without the processing, or maybe the opposite way around.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a thing that's freaky and she always need me, Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki.
So it's somewhat subtle, right? But it's still actually noticeable enough. Again, we're not doing a lot of crazy moves here. Sometimes the vocal chain or the individual plugins on a vocal chain will be doing more of that, right? Pushing and pulling things in a certain direction. But what the job of this bus, right, this a cappella master or vocal bus as I've been referring to it as, the purpose for this is to really glue everything together and make things just feel more cohesive and uniform with one another. And you might have noticed that. You might have noticed that the delays and the ad-libs and certain things that were supposed to be more in the background, they feel a little bit more up front and in the pocket, while also being mindful of the fact that there's this main vocal that's really the driving point of the vocal performance, right? So hopefully you understand the logic of what I'm trying to do here, what I'm using this vocal bus for, and you can already hear how it's basically affecting the vocal sound. So with that in mind, let's actually talk about what's on my vocal bus step by step. And I do want to just warn you that this is not necessarily something that you're supposed to copy exactly as it is, okay? This is a disclaimer. Every vocal bus, just like every vocal chain, is going to be a little bit different and unique. But again, because this is a bit more broad strokes, you can probably get away with mirroring this somewhat closely, but of course, be mindful of your track, your vocal, and what it actually needs. I'm going to break down what I thought this track needed, how I went to reach for these different plugins to ultimately tighten things up, smooth it out, and make it sound better. So with that in mind, the first thing that I have in this vocal bus chain is a MS EQ. And I'm going to use the Brainworks BX Digital V3, great MS plugin. You can see there's a mono section and a stereo section. Each is controlled in their own sort of section. So I'm basically able to EQ the mids and the sides differently. And the reason for this is because basically the main vocal, a lot of the tracks here are mono, which is pretty standard, right? For a vocal track. When you're recording to one mic. And basically that's just supposed to be a centered signal, right? Just right down the center. Unless you have stuff panned left and right. The mono section, you're really going to be affecting anything that's panned down the middle, which is going to be mostly the main vocals, right? And how they stack on top of each other. So if I have a main and a background and, you know, some ad-libs and they all are perfectly like zero in the middle, then that's what I'm going to be affecting with this mono section. The stereo section is going to be more affecting stuff that's panned hard left, hard right into the stereo field. And it'll also be affecting effects, so things like reverb, delays, and other ambiances, because those are typically more in the stereo field. So sometimes you want to sculpt these things to just make things sound a little bit better or gel better with one another. So let's focus first on the mono section. So all I'm doing here is I'm doing a little bit of a roll off at 20, a very gradual roll off, okay, 20 hertz. So I'm getting rid of low end, but really this is just rumble, and this is like housekeeping stuff. This is stuff that you're always going to pretty much be doing with vocals, and if you've seen my vocal chain videos, you know that I typically will filter off some of the low end to create a little bit more clarity and shift the attention of the frequencies upward in the spectrum. So I'm not going to explain that a whole lot, just getting rid of that low end, making sure we have no rumble, and making sure things sound as clean as humanly possible, while at the same time doing this to prioritize the low end from the actual instrumental, because the instrumental has a bass, a kick, and those things really need to be a lot more dominant in that range, and I'm trying to move things out of the way. I'm trying to move the vocal out of the way specifically in this case. Now, if you actually look, you'll see that I really only have a couple of moves I've done here, and it's really two moves. I'm getting rid of 588 hertz by about 0.5, so hardly anything, right? Half of a dB. And then I'm getting rid of 3.37, about the same. Now, this is just personal choices, but let's actually hear what that frequency I'm getting rid of sounds like.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, Next time.
Now you can hear it ringing out a little bit more during some parts rather than others, right? But really this is just like a low nasal kind of thing, and it's kind of particular to the section and the tonality of Oshan's voice, right, in this case. A lot of people do have nasally voices. I also have one, so you're going to generally get rid of somewhere in this pocket. I would say between 500 and 1200. Just depends on the quality of a person's voice. The higher it is, the more on the high end, closer to that 1200 point, you might have to get rid of and notch down if you just feel that it's too nasally. But if it's a lower tonality, then you're obviously going to be closer to where we are here. Now let's listen to the other one, 3.37. This is a really important frequency area for the vocals, because this is really where a lot of the intelligibility comes from. And in this case, I'm actually pulling this frequency down, probably getting a little bit of too much presence. Let's actually hear it.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah.
It's not the absolute worst, but I just felt like it was a little bit too brittle for my taste, so I wanted to just pull it down. You see I'm pulling it down just by a 0.7. And that's it. All I'm really doing is 3 moves. The filter, and then notching out these 2 problem frequencies ever so slightly, but not that noticeable, right? Because if it's less than 1 dB, you're probably not going to notice it. In fact, you might even be able to go more crazy than that, go as low as -2, removing that much frequency, and still maybe not suffer any repercussions from it. Now on the stereo side, all I'm doing is I'm not using any of these bands at all. The only thing I'm doing is I'm using the filter, and I'm filtering out 90 hertz and below, okay? So this is basically the extreme low end, and really that low end doesn't exist in the stereo field usually, right? Like we don't really want to have anything in that area unless it's like a stylistic thing. But in my case, I don't want anything in that lower vicinity. I want to just keep it really focused on the midsection for that, and really not even need any low end at all for these vocals, if I'm being honest. I mean, when I say low, I mean that sub like frequency, like bass, kick drum frequency. We don't really need that. We definitely need some low mids, and we still need a little bit of low for warmth and presence, but not as much as usually we get when we're recording. So I'm going to filter this out. Now the issue with this plugin is, for whatever reason, when I solo this, it doesn't actually play you like 90 hertz and below. It's not going to show you what that sounds like. It's going to show you what everything sounds like without this frequency. So I'm going to play it anyways, but I just want to make sure you know that we're not actually hearing 90 hertz. What we're hearing is actually what this sounds like after the fact, and just this soloed section, just the soloed stereo section. Check this out.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me.
And if you want, maybe what I could do is instead I could turn this off and set this to 90. This is not going to be an exact replica, but right now if I play this, now you'll actually be able to hear what I'm losing. Probably going to be very difficult for you to hear that, if anything. I could hear it, you know what I mean, but some people probably won't. But that's kind of just proving my point. It's such an unnecessary frequency that I'm not even going to use it at all. I'm going to get rid of it because it's not really adding anything. So that's pretty much it with this MSEQ, just doing some housekeeping, a lot of filtering more than anything, and just reducing certain problem spots in specific sections, whether it's the mono or stereo section. Sometimes I do like to use dynamic EQ. I actually do prefer that more often than not. But in this case, that's what I decided to do on this track, and I think it worked. Now the next plugin in the chain is a compressor, and I specifically use the Fatso Senior, the Empirical Labs EL7. This is from UAD. You could use any other compressor though, to be honest. I just love using this on my vocal bus. I don't know why. I guess because it gives you some saturation, and there's a lot of different controls that are really cool. It's got a built-in transformer, right? It gives you the certain sound, right? And just a lot of different control over how you can affect whatever you're running through it. It's cool for basses, it's cool for guitars, it's cool for leads. It really works on a lot of things, and I love it on vocals especially. Compression is absolutely a critical second step to really balance the difference in volume between those subtle parts like the ad-libs with the main stuff, with the main leads and the backgrounds and anything else like that, right? We're just really balancing the volume of the two and bringing them closer together because of the nature of compression. And all I'm doing is I actually have it set to the tracking mode, the bus tracking mode here. And I'm probably losing about 3 dB, which is a little bit more aggressive than what I normally would lose on a track. But if you check this out, you're going to see sort of how this really impacts the source material. So let me take it out first, play it and put it in, and then we'll talk more about these actual settings.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time.
If you hear what I hear, it's like very airy, and that's why I think I like this thing. I think it adds quite a bit of air, almost like an EQ would, but without doing any sort of boosting. And if you've noticed, I haven't boosted anything on this vocal bus yet, right? We're going to talk about that slowly, but this compressor, all it's really doing is keeping things in check, right? Because there's different dynamics throughout the track. There's different vocals. You can kind of hear there's a background happening at the same time as Oshan's verse. And when that happens, things are a little bit louder, right? You can see it kind of reducing as much as 5 dB, which again is a little bit more aggressive than usual. But then a lot of times it's really floating between this 1 to 2 point, but then jumping to 5 when it's really excessive and then coming back down. So overall, we're not losing a crazy amount of volume, and if we are, I feel like it's very balanced because I'm definitely adding back some output. You can kind of see much like an 1176, you basically feed an input and then you balance the output, right? So in this case, I'm trying to give just enough input, in this case around 4.5, to achieve this, and then I'm balancing the output to turn it down, and I'm trying to match things as best as I can. I know it's not going to be perfect. I usually will add a little bit more gain so it sounds a little bit sweeter, but overall it's controlling things, and you can really hear it controlling it again when you listen to an ad-lib. So now that I've said that, let me just play this one more time and pay attention to that and just sort of see what triggers this and causes it to react, and then think about how this might work in your own situation.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time.
So right there, the need me, yeah. That's where this is jumping up to 5, right? But otherwise, we're kind of down here. It totally adds up. And there isn't really a whole lot of additional settings here. You can obviously kind of play with the tranny settings and even adjust the attack and release. I've just sort of left things. I haven't even added any low frequency saturation or any of that stuff. I'm just sort of leaving things where they initially were and really playing with this input and output and getting the gain reduction that I want. To be honest, even though I didn't do it here, I probably would set the slowest possible attack being 60 and probably somewhere around that 0.5 to 1.1 second release, right? So it's a quicker release. So a slow attack, quick release, that should give you a more transparent sound. And try to get, in my opinion, between 1 to 3 dB of gain reduction. I am going crazy here. This is not something that you should fully model, but you know, I ended up getting the result that I wanted, and of course I understand what I'm really trying to achieve here. If you're still unfamiliar with compression in general, I'll actually leave a link to a video right now all about it so that you can watch it, absorb it, and understand better how to implement this into your own mixing setup. Now, the third step on this vocal bus is a multi-band compressor. I'm specifically using the FabFilter Pro MB. You've probably seen me using this in a lot of my other videos, and for good reason. It's damn good. Now, the way I use this is somewhat like an EQ where I'm focused on specific frequency bands, but at the same exact time, I'm trying to really control dynamics and levels of things so that they don't get too excessive. Now, in this case, I'm really focusing on the low end overall because we have multiple voices stacking up on top of each other. Each of these has their own respective amount of low end, and sometimes that can just create this excessive energy buildup down there, right? We're talking between 600 hertz to the very bottom being 30, right? 30 to 600. So quite a big range. Let me just solo this and show you what I'm talking about.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah.
So mostly low end, but some of that low mid, right? And as you can see, this might look a little bit more aggressive, but we're actually only getting rid of upwards of 2 dB and maybe not even that, at least on this low band, right? Let's actually watch this one more time, pay attention, see exactly what I'm losing.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah.
Right, so we're losing really upwards of -1 dB, so about 1 dB at most, even though it's set to the maximum of -2. These are very small moves. This is not going to be very noticeable, right? And I'm doing it on purpose because I want this to be very transparent and just blend things together. However, as you can see, I've also added about 1 dB of gain. This is because I find sometimes this move will really impact the warmth, the presence of a vocal, and I don't always want that, right? Even though I'm trying to prevent things from becoming too excessive, too low-end heavy, and as a result sound muddy. That's what usually happens when there's too much low end on a vocal. I'm trying to prevent that, but at the same time, I still want to make sure that we're preserving some of that warmth, right? We can't just totally kill it. So doing it this way warms it up, preserves the low end, lets Oshan have his presence, especially when maybe there isn't as much low-end instruments, bass and kick happening, for example, and just preserving that, making sure that his vocal is very forward and still, you know, has that emphasis, right? Speaking of high end, I've got a specific frequency band here as well, also isolated, and it's from 1000 to 4000 hertz, specifically concentrating on 2000. And this is really the fundamental or the main part of the vocal. This is where the vocal really lives. And it's sort of the most important area in a lot of ways because this is where we're going to be able to really hear it and understand the intelligibility of a person's vocal. So it's important that we sort of do a few things, at least in my opinion, when it comes to using a multi-band compressor on the vocal bus. And that is to take this specific section that I have and use it to increase the consistency of the vocal, so make sure that it's a lot more consistent and easier to hear, so to speak, but at the same time, prevent it from becoming excessively harsh because this area really consists of a lot of sibilants sometimes. F's and S's and CH's and T's, stuff like that can sometimes live in this range depending on the vocalist and their tonality. So we want to control that so that way it doesn't create problems, especially for listeners on smaller listening devices like earbuds. I find this affects those people the most. So what I've done here is I've actually taken this and I've added a dB just like I did on the previous step, but I'm also setting my range to -2, so I'm able to lose as much as 1 dB. It's a subtler amount compared to here where I had it set to as much as -3, but of course I'm only losing, let's say, 1 dB on average. This is set a little bit less aggressively, but you're going to notice it's a bit more consistently reducing when I play this. So check this out. I'll put it in context first and play it with and without.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always leave me, yeah.
So it's a subtle difference, and there's definitely pros and cons to each, right? I would say that the uncompressed version is definitely a little bit more loud and in your face, but it also has a little bit more of that harshness or potential problems for harshness that I was talking about. Whereas when I have it in, it seems a little bit more subdued, but there are some next steps that we're going to take, right, to kind of gain on this or add some more to this. But the benefit is it's of course controlling those problem spots that I mentioned. So using this and focusing on a couple of specific bands, particularly the low end to reduce muddiness and clear it up and keep it focused right on the highs, but using that low end to clean up that bottom end, and then using this high end, especially in that vocal pocket, to make sure that the vocal's very consistent while also not too harsh. Sort of the two main strategies that I use with the Pro MB. Now, if you want to learn more about the Pro MB and how to use it on vocals, I'll leave a link to a video up above that uses it, and it should be helpful for you if you're trying to get better with using this tool on your vocal mixes. Now, the fourth plugin on this vocal bus is a FabFilter Pro Q3, so an EQ, right? I'm using the FabFilter stuff because I just love their products, and this is really just doing some additional housekeeping, some additional frequency pockets that are popping up after doing that previous processing. So as an example, we're compressing stuff and then we're doing some multiband stuff, and we're sort of lifting frequencies and adjusting frequencies at the same time, even if it's not as direct. This compression and emphasis on certain frequency ranges kind of elicits a certain response and requires some additional treatment. And in this case, I'm deciding to go in and just do an additional filter, reducing everything from 50 hertz and below on a 12 dB octave, right? So let's just solo this and play it. So very subtle, but just getting rid of this low end. It's not even that important. It's not really adding anything, as you could tell. It's pretty much just low end rumble. You may not even be able to fully hear it depending on what you're listening on. So again, just doing that housekeeping, because as of course, even though we did this in the first step a little bit, by adding these next steps, we're kind of increasing that low end again. So I want to just make sure I'm fully controlling it in this case. Now from there, I'm doing a little bit of additional treatment in a very small amount, but I'm turning down 217 hertz by 0.75, so not even a dB. You can tell these are very, very small moves. They actually look bigger, but check out my sense of scale here, 6 dB. It's not as big as it looks. So let me actually just solo this frequency and show you what I'm getting rid of. So it's this very specific low frequency that you can hear that's just kind of continuing to poke out. So I'm just taming that a little bit more, and I am doing it statically, but a dynamic EQ probably would have been pretty cool here as well. Now the next one was around 1,269 hertz. I'm actually doing a little bit more of an aggressive move, getting rid of -1. This is definitely a harsh kind of airy area. It's just a specific resonance that I find I'm usually taking out of my mixes, somewhere around that 12,000 range, depending on the frequency of the artist's voice. Check this out. So brittle is how I would describe that. It's a very brittle type of sound. You know what I mean? So obviously taking the steps to get rid of that. And really this again is going to be situational depending on your track, but I just wanted to make sure I continue to get rid of any harsh high-end stuff that's poking out at me, as well as any low-end stuff to create even more clarity. So this is almost building upon that previous step with the multiband, but doing it a little bit differently and continuing to tighten. As you can tell, these are all very small, subtle moves that are going to add up over time, once again, to create a nice loud vocal. Now the fifth plugin in this vocal bus is a distortion plugin, and I'm specifically using Lo-Fi from Avid. This is a great plugin. I've definitely used it on a lot of stuff. You may have seen it on some of my other videos. Very simple, very easy to use, and I'm honestly doing just one extremely tiny and almost insignificant thing, but that's ultimately achieving something more. And that is adding 0.1 distortion to the vocal. Okay, so we're doing a tiny amount of distortion, and that's going to ultimately create some more saturation and higher frequency content. It's going to basically warm up the overall sound of the vocal, right? Even at this small of a percentage. And that's just going to make it sound a little bit more pleasing sonically usually, right? If we push it too far, of course, we're going to end up in Travis Scott or Yeezy territory, and we don't really want to do that. We want to just add a subtle amount that doesn't really create any sort of fuzz or distortion, no stylistic stuff, but really just warms up the sound. So check this out. I'm going to bypass this. And again, this is the only thing I've done. No saturation, no noise, nothing else. Just this, adding a touch of it. I'm going to put it in and let's see how much of a difference it makes.
Time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki. With a team that's freaky and
So as you can tell, even though it's such a small, subtle move, it's really increasing the presence and the vibe of this vocal, right? You can hear a little bit more emphasis on the low end, which is interesting because we've sort of taken it down and managed that a little bit more throughout these different steps, through the multiband, through the Pro Q and all that. But now we're using this to now just take it up a notch, right? Do the opposite. Let's give it a little bit more juice in this case, right? And again, it's a subtle move. Now, if you don't have access to lo-fi like I'm using here, don't worry about it. You can use any kind of vocal saturation, any kind of distortion. But as you can tell, keep it very light and minimal. And if you do have access to a distortion plugin that gives you dry-wet mix access where you can kind of blend it in, use that for sure. You're going to be adding less than 10%. Maybe even that would be too much to your vocal sound, but you can see how this is really going to add up quite a bit. Now, if you want to watch another video that's really interesting, all about vocal saturation and how to use it to increase the presence of your vocal, kind of like how I'm doing it here, I'll leave a link to it up above. I show you with a bunch of different plugins, and I know that'll definitely be helpful if you've never seen it before. So the second last plugin I have in this chain is a De-Esser, and sticking with my theme of using FabFilter plugins, I've got the FabFilter Pro DS, and this is a really situational move here, okay? I'm doing this on this track because I still feel that there's some sibilance problems, but because this is on a group and therefore affecting multiple sounds, not just one vocal, but you know, a bunch of vocals, right? I want to make sure that I do this in a very transparent way. Transparent is the key to this whole bus, period. You want to be very delicate and subtle with the moves here. If you have a vocal that is sibilant, that's a little bit harsh on the ears, you want to obviously take a step like this, and I'm putting it towards the end of the chain because a lot of these other steps that I've done, such as my saturation, which is sort of acting like an EQ and adding some more higher end harmonics and warming up the sound of the vocal, that is sometimes triggering and creating some additional sibilance problems. And I want to make sure I put this step after that to manage those problems if they're there, right? You may not have this problem at all, and you may therefore not need to use a De-Esser, but I'm still going to make sure that I talk about it because that's obviously what I did here. Now, in my case, what I'm doing is I have a very specific band, somewhere between 7,000 and 13K. Let's hear what frequencies or what sounds are really going to be popping up in this band before I talk about next steps. Right? So it's almost like a little bit of a high nasally kind of sound, right? Very harsh for sure, you know, a little bit overwhelming is how I would describe it. It's not even as harsh as maybe I make it seem, but still definitely poking out in a way that I don't like. So I've obviously isolated this band, and again, it's a very specific band. I'm making sure that I'm really only capturing the fundamental problem spots. I'm not grabbing everything in the vocal. I'm not going down to 2,000 hertz and as high as 16 or 20. I'm really focusing on a narrow band here, which you could tell. Now, I have a range set to 3. That means 3 is the most amount of volume I'm going to lose. Let's actually pay attention. I'm going to play this one more time and see how much volume is coming down here based on how I've set my range and, of course, set my threshold as well, because the threshold is going to determine how much of this takes place.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah.
So even though my range is set to 3, you see we're losing maybe at most -2 dB, right? So it's not actually going down or being reduced as much as I have this set up, right? And I've also, of course, set my threshold so that it doesn't react as aggressively. If I have my threshold closer to, let's say, 9 o'clock or earlier, that's when you're going to start seeing some more crazy reactions, right? By doing this, by having a less aggressive threshold and by having a very specific band selected, and as well as my range being not too aggressive, because I could have a range of 6 or 10, which would be a lot more aggressive. We have a very subtle range here, -2 being the reduction we're getting. It's overall going to sound very transparent. Now, if you're somebody that's dealing with harsh vocals in general and you've tried things like a De-Esser and it isn't working, I've got a great video for you. It's called How to Fix Harsh Vocals. I'm going to leave a link to it up above right now. It's one of my most popular videos, but I break down a bunch of different strategies, including this one, that'll help you solve your problem and make sure that your vocals aren't going to be piercing people's ears when they're listening. And our final plugin on this vocal bus is none other than a limiter. This is a FabFilter Pro L2. I actually just did a video about using a limiter on your vocals, and a lot of that logic really does tie into what we're doing here. And what I'm really saying here is, and I've had a few heated debates with a few people as well about this, is we're not using the limiter to do anything except for make sure that the track is not clipping, okay? That's what brick wall limiting is. We're trying to prevent stuff from clipping and peaking, and we're doing that. And I'm not enhancing it. I'm not adding anything, although you certainly could, especially if you are mixing a track on top of a pre-mixed beat that's limited and has all kinds of mastering on it. You may want to actually add some gain, add some volume, and kind of limit the vocal a little bit more aggressively. In fact, I have a video that will help you with that. It's all about how to mix vocals over a 2-track beat, and this is one step. I'm not going to talk about it here, but I'll leave a link to it up above right now, so you can check it out if you do want to learn more about how to make sure that your vocals sit well on top of a 2-track, but that's something else. So with this, all we're doing is we're using the out ceiling, and we're setting it to 0.3, so we're preserving 100% 0.3 dB of headroom. We're never going to exceed 0.3, and if we do, this limiter is essentially going to reduce that section, but I'm not adding any gain, so that should pretty much never be happening unless the vocal gets too close to that clipping point. Now, because I have some advanced settings here, and that's obviously something that the FabFilter Pro L2 allows, some limiters don't have access to these controls, I have a slower attack and a fast release, okay? So I'm trying to set this to be very transparent and just let the signal pass through, but if there is something that is a problem, only then will it actually react and turn it down, right? It'll actually reduce the volume or limit the volume to prevent that clipping. So with that in mind, let's just pay attention. I'll play this and let's see if there is any reduction. It'll be happening here. There might not be, but let's check it out.
Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki with a team that's freaky and she always need me, yeah. Next time you need me, I'll be in Thessaloniki.
So as you can tell, not getting any action here, that's totally fine. We're not actually trying to make anything happen with this limiter. All we're trying to do is just make sure that it does not clip, right? And we could, of course, mitigate that in the first place by playing with gain staging, manipulating the output volume of all these different plugins that we've used. But just to be safe, I always like to have a limiter there, especially like this. If it's not really working, it's not really changing the sound. But of course, if we are getting some limiting happening, some gain reduction happening, well, then we know that maybe we need to address a few additional things. Our goal, again, is not to get any sort of extreme limiting. It's really just if there's the odd moment where clipping is taking place, well, that is obviously where we need to do this, right? But otherwise, if you're doing gain staging properly, if you're setting your levels properly, then you shouldn't really be running into this issue anyways. Everything should be good. And by the way, if you haven't seen, and I know I've plugged a lot of videos here, but if you haven't seen my gain staging video, how to set levels when mixing, it's a super deep video that'll show you how you should be thinking about setting your levels in a mix. And like the others, I'm going to leave a link to it up above or in the description right now. So there you have it. I hope you found this helpful. This was my vocal bus video. I appreciate you guys for watching. If you're new here and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. I drop a new video just like this every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. If you're a subscriber coming back, I appreciate you for watching. And to everybody watching, I really want to ask if you could please smash that like button. That not only helps me and helps you see more of my content, but it helps the YouTube algorithm know that it needs to show more of my stuff to other people like you. All I'm trying to do is help people for free, spend thousands and thousands of dollars on this knowledge. I've done tons of life experience stuff, working for Grammy Award winning people and all that good stuff. And now I'm sharing this stuff with you completely for free. So all I ask is that you do a couple of things. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and smash that like button if you like it. And if you didn't like it, well, what are you doing here? Why are you still here? Leave. All right. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. I'm looking forward to helping you guys again on the next one. Peace.
5,